Hi class. So I just want to go over all the information about color with you for this week because there's a lot of info. So here's an example of a painting by Matisse. He was an excellent colorist. If you aren't familiar with his work, I suggest you Google him and see as much of it as possible. So color is actually reflected light. And here's an example. So light hits a prism and then the colors come out. I'm sure we've all seen that. But what people don't always realize is the colors we see are the ones that are reflected back to us. And I'll say a little bit more about that. I can get my page to change. Okay. So the first thing that we talk about with color is hue, which is sort of another word for color. It's slightly different. If I say red, there are many hues of red. Here's some examples right here, okay? So hue speaks about the color. So here we're seeing the hue of sort of a gold, ochre. Here's sort of a rust red. Here's a green, here's a blue. Those are all hues. When we talk about value, we're talking about relative lightness or darkness. So this picture has probably 7 different values of kind of a bluish gray. This one may have fewer. This one probably has more. So it's just relative lightness and darkness. And there's actually quite a few different tints and shades that can be made with any hue. The way you create a tint is to add white to it. The way you create a shade is to add black to it. So here in the middle is the original hue. Here are the 3 swatches with white added to it, making for tints. And here are the 3 shades, which means black has been added to it. Now when we talk about saturation, we're talking about the brightness or the dullness of a color or the strength or the weakness of a color. So these are all 100% saturated colors, okay? Let me show you an example of this in Photoshop. Hold on. Okay, so here I am in Photoshop and I'm going to make a square. That's a selection. Okay, I'm going to make a square. And it came out as a gradient, which is not what I wanted to do. I accidentally hit the gradient. Okay, now here's a square. It's going to be white because that's the, let's start over. Okay, that was an example of me making some mistakes. So, okay, I want to make a square. So I'm going to double click on the foreground color. And this is a great way to look at saturation. So this color right up here is 100% saturated. It hasn't been mixed with black or white. And as I go towards the white corner, you can see that I'm adding more white to it and it's changing. Here I'm adding some gray to it, which is called a tone, and here I'm adding some black to it. So anything that is not up here is diminishing the saturation. So this is 100% saturation, and then we can go down to varying degrees of desaturation or less saturation. Okay, so let's go back to our classroom. Alright, so here you're seeing highly saturated colors. They're bright, not at all dull. Alright, so now there's different primary colors for different color systems. So when you're using paint or crayons or any kind of pigment, red, yellow, and blue are our primaries. You cannot mix those colors, but you can mix them to create all the other colors. Additive primaries are primaries that are made from light, so like on a TV or computer monitor. So those are red, green, and blue. And subtractive primaries, which are used in the printing process, are cyan, magenta, and yellow. Okay, so here's some art that uses primary colors, the traditional ones. So I mentioned before that when we see a color, we're really seeing the reflected light. So what happens when you see blue is that all the other colors are absorbed in the surface and blue is reflected back to you, in this case cyan. Alright? So when something appears white, it's because all of the colors are reflected back to the viewer combined. Okay? And black means all the colors are absorbed into whatever it is, whatever surface the light is hitting. Alright? So here's what happens when we mix the additive colors, which, as I said before, are for televisions and computer monitors and phones and any monitor. And they're created by light. And there's an example of them in fine art. Right? Let's see, did I miss a page? Okay, here's the traditional primaries. Okay, so that's a traditional color wheel, and for those of you who haven't studied color, a complementary color is the two colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel. So the oranges and blues, the reds and greens, the purples and yellows. And here's some example of red, yellow, and blue, the traditional primaries being used in art. Okay, and the process primaries, which are used for the printing process, CMYK, are shown here. And the light primaries we just discussed, red, blue, and green. Okay, complementary hues I just mentioned, but here's the kind of the generic categories, red and green. You can think of Christmas, yellow and violet. I always think of flowers because a lot of times a yellow flower will have a violet stamen inside. Color, nature mixes colors in complements very beautifully. Blue and orange, I think of the desert and the sky. Okay, and here's complementary pairs in the process primaries. Okay, so magenta and green, cyan and red, blue and yellow. Color schemes. Now this is the part that's really important for you to pay attention to because you'll be using this in your assignment. Achromatic, that means chroma is color in Latin. Okay, so achromatic means no color. Monochromatic means one color. Analogous means similar colors, or colors that are adjacent to each other on the color wheel, next to each other on the color wheel. Warm colors are all the colors that are like what would be warm in real life. Yellow, red, orange. Cool are blues, greens, purples. Complementary we just discussed. Neutral are very have very little saturation. Okay, and we'll look at that here. So here's without color, achromatic, and here's some examples in art. The Guggenheim Museum. And here's some more. Okay, monochromatic, one color. Alright. Blue, here's the most saturated color, the least saturated. Red, yellow, blue. Okay, let's look at some more. Analogous, so see how similar all these colors are? They would also appear next to each other on the color wheel, so that's a way to remember that. Okay. Warm colors, pretty self-explanatory. Cool colors. So you can see that there's a lot you can do with color and these color schemes. Complementary, so you're going to have all the variations of the two colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel, or red and green, yellow and purple, blue and orange. Neutral colors, so they have very little saturation. They're usually earth tones, flesh tones, grays. Okay. Alright, the color variation section I'm going to let you look through yourself. And I want you to go through all the vocabulary and make sure you're clear on that. And I just want to say a word about assignment 1. Make sure that your 4 thumbnails basically use the same shapes and lines and elements. So basically this has sort of this 3-dimensional maze and some circles and a little rocket ship or something. So this artist has explored those using only those elements in 4 different compositions or arrangements. So make sure you do that. A lot of times students tend to have 4 very different thumbnails, and that's not what we're doing. What we're doing here is looking for the best arrangement of the same elements. Okay? And with assignment 2, make sure you label your color schemes, okay, the way they are in the example. And also, I want you to use more than 2 colors on at least 3 of your thumbnails. So on one you can use 2 colors, and if you're using a monochromatic you can use just 1 color, but I want you to use more than 2 colors on your 2 other thumbnails. Okay? Alright, good luck with this. I'm excited to see what you guys come up with.